In a number of pieces that I've been narrating, I've been talking about social displacements and larger issues, including forced migration, Holocaust of slavery, and genocide, and the other large issues of violence in recent history and the history of the 20th century. I used the word genocide to refer to the murder of Palestinians in Israel. And I've been paying attention to the kinds of censorship that have been employed to silence protests of the systematic violence that the state of Israel wages against the Palestinian people. Mark Ruffalo recently was censored and replied with what he referred to as an apology, saying that his use of the word genocide was hyperbole, inflammatory, and I can't remember what the other term that he used was. But it made me question whether these definitions and these descriptions of these definitions are in fact hyperbole and inflammatory. Now, I would like to distinguish between inflammatory and hyperbole for a minute, because I think that the outrage in using the term genocide to refer to the state of Israel is understandable in a certain sense. Even though it may be accurate, it's still psychologically understandable. Recently, Bernie Sanders, who is sensitive in large part to the plight of Palestinians in the state of Israel, asked for a de-escalation of rhetoric. And I understand that gesture, that rhetorical gesture as well. I began to think back to Israel's support of the apartheid regime in South Africa. When South Africa had no qualms utilizing the word apartheid and apartheidist to describe itself. And beginning in the 70s and continuing on until the very end, in which the apartheid state of South Africa no longer existed, Israel had supported the South African government, had many sort of economic deals and didn't divest when almost all of the European nations and even U.S. interests in oil interests and other interests in South Africa had already been divested. And so I wondered, if I would find an entry on Israel in one of my teacher's books in the index. And as you can see, this is a Dennis Brutus book, Poetry and Politics. Israel is not included. And the ellipsis I find, disturbing, because it points to this ubiquitous censorship. One is not allowed to criticize the state of Israel without being accused of antisemitism. And I question that. I question the symmetry and alignment, the absolute one-to-one correspondence of acceptance of the policies of Israel and one's relationship to Jewish culture and the assumption, I suppose, that if one is to criticize Israel, that one must be an anti-Semite. The absence is quite profound here, I think. And So I looked up on the web to see if I could get any information on those last years of support of Israel, of the South African apartheid nation. The reason that I'm focusing on this is because apartheid is one of the terms that so many took offense to, that and genocide, and so I wanted to see if there was an acknowledgement of an indifference to the racism that is irrefutable, on the part of the white South African apartheid regime, and how it's explained in passages that describe this moment in history. So one of the passages I found is interesting. It describes it in this way, and I'll quote it. How did Israel, starting in the 1970s, become a friend of the apartheid regime to such an extent that by 1986 it was the only Western nation that did not take part in sanctions imposed on South Africa? It's tempting to point to the Six-Day War as the turning point, but in this complex story, the occupation of the West Bank was not the cause of this change. Among the many reasons was the 1973 war, in which Israel refrained from firing the opening shot that led most African countries to break off their ties with Israel, yielding to Arab pressure and the embargo on oil, whose price skyrocketed right after the war. Isolated, and possibly due to its nuclear requirements, Israel was cornered into seeking relations with South Africa. This obviously does not remove the moral stain. The historic truth, however, is that Israel never willingly supported the apartheid regime and is far from being the villain in this complex saga. Now, this really interests me because so much, in spite of this passing recognition that says this obviously does not remove the moral stain, the rest of this entire argument assumes this position that Israel had no choice but to support the South African government and to have economic dealings with the South African government. It uses words like never willingly supported, far from being the villain, was forced into, cornered by. So all of these expressions, create this victim on the part of the state. The state was a victim of these economic circumstances, couldn't help but support apartheid. But I wonder, isn't this very much like the way that one justifies slavery or any kind of oppressive policies against humanity? That we didn't have a choice, because if we had done otherwise, we would have economically failed. I had hoped that I would find an entry in Dennis's index for Israel, if nothing else but to clear the record. But there certainly was always a choice. Even in the United States, in the history of slavery, there were people who didn't support it. The Amish people taught the Quakers that this wasn't something that Christians do. And once they did, the Quakers became very active in abolitionist movements and supporting freed slaves. You always have a choice. So the fact that this history is sort of smoothed over, and apologized for in this manner that really removes the responsibility, again, suggests this inability to face the realities of these situations. The real excuse for posting this little talk and discussion is so that I can put a couple of links that detail parts of the history of Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, and how the two words apartheid and genocide are very accurate facts. Now, having said that, and I'm not apologizing for my use of those words, I do understand what the psychological burden of taking on the responsibility of those words is for a people that were victims of genocide and that have been victims of a kind of not even apartheid on the part of a state, but an apartheid on a part of a whole continent, right? I mean, basically, the fact of Jewish displacement is one that is not centuries old, but millennia old, because of the oppression of nations across, sweeping nations across the European continent and in other places around the world. So, yeah, it's very easy to understand the psychological trauma involved in bearing the burden of having been such a devastatingly oppressed people and having become the oppressor, but without bearing that burden and looking at the truth, the historical truth, without using words like cornered and far from being, and expressions like far from being the villain, and it's complicated, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One needs to take moral responsibility for one's actions, and I think, in order for us to develop beyond like the fear, right, of offense, we need to clearly understand that being critical of the authoritarian, racist, oppressive apparatus of the state of Israel does not necessarily constitute anti-Semitism. And we should all be willing to see what is the truth, in spite of how difficult it may be to say it within a context that clarifies one's position, right? Because, yeah, it is very much psychologically a burden to look at one's responsibility. And yet, that's the burden that we bear.